Everyone, good evening. I'm Bee Sheehan, and on behalf of the Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. We'd like to thank the Patent Free Library for making these programs possible and for hosting us again this conference season. Camden Conference is a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum driven almost exclusively by volunteers, in keeping with our mission of fostering informed discourse on world issues. We offer a series of community events like this one leading up to our annual weekend conference. This year's conference, our 38th, on Democracy Under Threat, a Global Perspective, will take place February 21st to 23rd, live at the Camden Opera House and streamed to venues in Rockland and for the first time in Falmouth at Lunt Auditorium. For more information, please visit us at camdenconference.org. And tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Pamela Cox, who shares her insights into "Is democracy the secret sauce to growth and prosperity?" Pamela is a former vice president of the World Bank who worked on economic issues in Latin America, Africa, India, and East Asia. So covering a lot of ground. Please give a warm welcome to Pamela Cox.
Very much, Bea. And I'm also aware that in addition to everyone in the room, we have people online too. So I'll try to also look up into the camera. Thank you to the Camden Conference and to the Patent Free Library for the invitation to speak. I think I originally got the invitation because I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Maine. But everything I say today is not the point of view or the position of the League of Women Voters of Maine. I'm speaking in my personal capacity. Also, I am not a political scientist at all. I'm an economist. So when I received this, I said, well, what can I say about democracy from an economic point of view? I have been working for about 35 years on issues of economic growth and development and do have some perspectives on that. And as I was saying before the talk, I promise this is not an arcane talk. There are no economic terms. There are no graphs, no axes to figure out. But hopefully I can make the points I want to make. Well, what do we want to talk about? First of all, we want to talk about growth. All countries obviously want to grow. If you're a poor country, and for our purposes, we define a poor country as an annual per capita gross domestic product, GDP, of $1,145 or less. Now, to give you a little bit of perspective how poor that is, the US per capita GDP is $82,145. So a country living, on under $1,200 a year per capita is pretty poor. And then, of course, every poor country wants to become a middle income country, which is a per capita income of about $14,000 a year. And of course, then everybody wants to become a high income country. And then every country that's a high income country wants to become richer and richer. It's human nature. And certainly in the last 75 years, we've seen an unprecedented increase in global economic growth and prosperity. So extreme poverty rates, and these are amongst the whole world, have plummeted from 52% of the world population in 1950 to only 8% today. So that is a tremendous period of growth and increasing prosperity in human history. In addition, the ranks of middle-income countries has grown. So we used to have very rich countries and very poor countries, and now we're getting a lot more people in the middle, a lot bigger middle classes in various countries. At the same time, we had a lot more countries that are classified as democracies. Now, partly this was due, of course, to the end of colonialism, a lot of new countries emerging in the 1960s, and also the fall of the Soviet Union, which, in breaking up the Soviet Union, broke it into many countries which may or may not be democracies. At the same time, though, even though we've seen this global economic growth, we've also seen some very sharp differences in prosperity amongst countries. The richest 20% of the countries today are now 30 times richer than the poorest 20%, and that's a growing gap. And while East Asia and Latin America have been making some progress in increasing their share of global prosperity, Africa has pretty much remained the same for the last 150 years in terms of its percentage of global growth. So the question is, we've had global growth, we've had more democracies. So is there a link? Do democracies grow faster? Do their citizens enjoy higher incomes and better lives? And certainly as we see challenges to democracy increase around the world, including, of course, both in the US and in Europe, as well as in poorer countries such as India, what might this mean for future growth and prosperity? So those are some of the things I want to talk about a little bit today. I want to start with a definition because I recently read an article in The Atlantic that when people were talking about democracy during the election, people had very different ideas about what democracy is. Many people define democracy as having elections. Well, Venezuela just had elections. I don't think anybody would say that's really a democracy. And then many countries define themselves as a democracy. North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And I think we can all agree it is not a democracy. So usually when we say democracy, we mean more than elections. Democracy is usually defined as state power invested in people, either directly or through representatives. And the features of a democracy often include freedom of assembly and association, personal property rights, freedom of religion and speech, citizenship, consent of the governed, voting rights, and minority rights. So most people, when they think of democracy, don't really think of this whole ecosystem around democracy. Now, there are many, many indices, of course there's indices, that try to measure democracy. And here I turn to the Democracy Index from the Economist magazine, which is based on some 60 indicators, which I'm not going to go through, which are grouped into 5 categories. Basically, electoral process and pluralism, functioning of government, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties. And when you map this index on a global map, you can see that Western Europe and North America score very highly. Although I do want to emphasize the US is seen as a flawed democracy, and we can talk about why. And when you look at other regions, they have democracy indices that are not as high as Western Europe and the US. So your higher performing countries, according to these maps and putting this together, tend to be democracies. So is this really true? Is it really true that faster growing and richer countries tend to be more democratic? Now, of course, there is a growth industry in growth economics. Economists have studied how countries grow ever since Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. For those of you who aren't economists, that is the start of modern economics. So growth and getting richer has always been a sort of a central theme in economics. And there have been many, many books over the decades that have looked at these questions. And there's many theories out there, and you probably have read some of them. If you've read Guns, Germs, and Steel, there was the thesis that it's geography. Poor countries are hot and have tropical diseases. It's difficult to grow things in poor countries, so they're poor. Another one is culture. Of course, Max Weber and the Protestant ethic. Or if you look at East Asia, Buddhist culture, that you save and invest and therefore, have money to help you grow. Another theory is ignorance. Low education levels, lack of access to technology. This was a big explainer for why Africa tends to lag behind. And yet another series was about colonialism. This was very big in the 1970s, and a world trade economy that skewed against poor countries. So there have been many, many studies that have looked at this. Now, fortunately for my talk, and this didn't happen, this happened after I agreed, the Nobel Prize for Economics this year, which I'm sure all of you have followed very closely, went to three economists, Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, who won it for their work on why some countries succeed and others fail. So this was very timely for me and really helped me with this talk. I really recommend their book, which is Why Nations Failed. I guarantee you it is geared to non-economists. Their central argument is that economic institutions shape economic incentives to become educated, to save and invest, to innovate and adopt new technologies. These are all things that are needed for an economy to grow. But political institutions determine the ability of citizens to control politicians and how they behave. And for a country to succeed, you need alignment between the economic and the political institutions. To quote them, while economic institutions are critical for determining whether a country is poor or prosperous, it is politics and political institutions that determine what economic institutions a country has. So you have to have both. And they note that politics is the process by which a society chooses the rules that will govern it. Does a country have inclusive political institutions, and otherwise they're centralized and pluralistic? Or does it have extractive institutions that extract benefits for a small elite or oligarchy? And obviously, if you have a monarchy, you have a king, they get most of the benefits, other people get less. Okay? And so let's look at a few examples that they use to prove their point. Development of new technologies offer an opportunity for fundamental acceleration of growth. The wheel, the steam engine, electricity, the internet, all of these things have led to rapid economic growth when they've been introduced. And perhaps the best known example historically is the Industrial Revolution. So why did the Industrial Revolution take off in 18th century England? Why didn't it take off in France or Germany or Russia? And why did the Industrial Revolution enrich Europe and some of England's colonies, such as the US and Australia, but not others, such as India? Now, Acemoglu and Robinson traced the roots of the Industrial Revolution to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And with the blank look on all your faces, I can tell you do not remember what the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was. It was when England's Parliament deposed King James II, as he was a Catholic, and put in place his daughter Mary and her husband William and Mary, and restricted their power, and at the same time expanding political rights. So basically Parliament, which wasn't completely representative at the time because only people of a certain class and level of income could vote, but nevertheless, they pushed out a king, put another set of monarchs in, but expanded political rights at the same time. And in addition, they developed economic incentives that provided incentives for investment, trade, and innovation. They enforced property rights, including the idea of patents. They expanded the application of English law to all citizens. They ended arbitrary taxation and monopolies. They adopted mercantile policies. That meant they encouraged production for export. They encouraged domestic industry. Investors could monetize their investments. That's meant that Watt with the steam engine, Arkwright with the spinning frame, Brunel with steamships, all these inventors could earn money from the inventions that they put forward. And of course, this led to innovation, it led to industrialization, and it led to growth in England, and it helped England become a dominant world power in the 19th century. So that is an example of how when the political institutions were changed, when they expanded, when they gave people more rights, more participation in the economy, and when you had the right economic incentives at the same time, that you had patents, you had lack of monopolies, you had more competition. These two things together fueled the Industrial Revolution. There's another example of how differences in political institutions lead to different economic outcomes. We only need to look at North and South Korea. So at the end of the Korean War, South Korea had very little industry. Most of the industry had been located in the North. It was a war-ravaged economy. And now today, South Korea has living standards similar to Portugal and Spain. North Korea has living standards similar to those in Africa, or about 1/10 of South Korea. And that's due entirely to how the economies are organized. Market economies, investments in education, inclusive investment. Now, it is also true that Korea started its development path under military rule and was a very top-down, undemocratic system, but reversed in 1987 when they had a big push towards democracy, which is one of the explanations why South Korea reacted so strongly to the declaration of martial law recently. One more example, the two cities of Nogales, Mexico and Nogales, Arizona. Okay? All that's different is there's a border between the two cities. One's in the US, one's in Mexico. Income in Nogales, Arizona, per capita income is about $30,000 a year. Higher rates of education, health, security, obviously, while income in Nogales, Mexico is a third, $10,000, much lower rates of education, health, and security. Exactly the same population, but living under two systems. So I know you're all thinking about this because everybody thinks about this. And that's what about China? China is always the elephant in the room. Is China an exception to this theory? After all, they've had a top-down economic policy, no participatory political institutions, and few of the hallmarks of a democratic system. And China's growth and reduction in poverty since 1978 has been absolutely stunning. Extreme poverty fell from 85% of the population in 1981 to 0.7% today. China is now a middle income country. They have a per capita income of about $12,600. Although for the first 3 decades of the Communist Party rule, essentially from 1948 to 1978, were absolutely catastrophic for growth and poverty reduction in China. It included a famine, which killed between 15 and 55 million people. Nobody knows how many because it was such a closed economy. And in 1978, faced with a stagnant economy and extremely concerned about political stability, China under Deng Xiaoping began introducing more market-oriented economic reforms. First in agriculture, allowing small farmers to market what they grew essentially in farmers' markets, but then in other sectors. And when criticized for becoming more capitalist, Deng famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." So he was obviously said, listen, we got to grow this economy. We've got to turn to an economy that provides more economic incentives. So China invested very heavily in education and infrastructure. It allowed the development of private businesses alongside state-owned companies, and there are still many state-owned companies. It is not what one would call an active capitalist system. It encouraged, as we know, export-led development and manufacturing. It built many extremely successful world-class businesses, such as Alibaba, which is sort of like the Amazon of China, even bigger. Tencent, a gaming platform. It has huge technical knowledge and expertise in sectors such as solar power and electric vehicles, and as we just found out, AI. And there was a huge crop of Chinese technocrats such as Jack Ma, who led Alibaba. They attracted a lot of Western investment. So they created inclusive economic opportunities. But politically, China has not created inclusive political institutions, and it's reversing itself on economic inclusivity. Premier Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. He started cracking down on the private sector. A lot of these high-flying companies started sort of flying under the radar. He introduced more and more top-down economic planning, and growth on his watch has slowed. Officially, it's 5% a year, down from 10% a year 10 years ago. But it's likely half that because he is censoring the economic growth figures. Always a bad sign when somebody starts censoring economic data. They have not made the difficult reforms they need to make, especially to increase consumer spending and not depend so much on export-led growth, in favor of policies that are designed to boost Communist Party control, such as unsustainable borrowing. I'm sure a lot of people read about real estate speculations, investment in infrastructure and factories they don't need, and Western investment has absolutely collapsed because most Western investors don't feel there's any rule of law anymore for their investments. And I think, as we all know, China is now trying to export its way out of an economic slowdown. They have a record $1 trillion trade imbalance with the rest of the world. And I would add only 1/3 of that is with the US. So this isn't a US-China situation. It's really a China and the rest of the world situation. So looking ahead, can China make the leap from being a middle-income country to a higher-income country? And can their citizens enjoy a better life? And it's not clear that the model they have, which is essentially export-led development, is going to work, especially with US and Europe and other countries trying to block their imports. Let me turn to the question of prosperity and inequality. It's not enough for a country just to have a high GDP. It's also a question about how is that GDP or that income distributed within a country? Do the elite capture most of the income? Or do most citizens enjoy prosperity? I mean, you can see in some countries, particularly petrostates, where a lot of the income goes to the elites. So what is happening? So when we look at measures of inequality and incomes, and yes, there are measures for this, and I can quote them if you want. Higher income countries, aside from petrostates, tend to have lower inequality. Okay, their citizens tend to enjoy the fruits of their labor a lot more. So is this a cause or is this an effect? Healthy democracies deal with income inequality through taxation and redistribution. Not meaning that I'm taking the money from you and handing it to someone else, but rather government expenditures in education, health, and social security. If you listen to Paul Krugman, he says the federal government is basically an insurance company with an army. And that's what federal governments do. They redistribute through taxation. Now, democracies with inclusive political institutions have more pressure than others to redistribute. But in countries with extractive political institutions, the elites or the oligarchs, or in case of China, the state, capture more of the income. Now, if you look at income inequality amongst the richest countries, which are basically the Western countries in the US has the highest rate of income inequality, and it is getting worse. Now, in part, this is due to the tech revolution, but it's also due to changing norms. For example, in 1965, a CEO's pay was 20 times a worker's average pay. This increased to a ratio of 58-1 in 1989. And today it's a whopping 278-1. So we have seen, over the last 60 years, that it's suddenly okay for CEOs to make huge amounts. Clearly, there's a new oligarchy in the US. So the income share of the top 1%, okay, and to be in the top 1%, you have to earn $1.4 million or more. So it really is up there. The share of the top 1% in the US after taxes and transfers was 6% in 1980, and it's 13% today. So it's more than doubled. We have an economy that is getting more unequal. And of course, the last time we faced such a situation was in the 1880s, the famous Gilded Age. You've seen it on television and you've read about it. And where large monopolies, and at that time they were called trusts, not monopolies, such as Standard Oil, US Steel, the railroads, dominated the US economy. And I think we know the names of the so-called robber barons, Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Morgans. These families, had immense economic power in the US at that time. But how did the US cope with that? Well, a growing movement started pushing back on the monopolies or the trusts. And it actually started with Midwest farmers who were very hard hit by the monopoly pricing on the railroads. So when they sent their goods to market, they were paying high transport rates. And the growing political movement sought to curb the monopolies through legislation, the famous trust-busting legislation, the Sherman Act, which still exists, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which still exists, muckraking journalism. One of the issues was nobody really knew the extent of Standard Oil and what they owned and all their tentacles in the economy, as they put it. And it was Ida Tarbell and the famous muckraking journalists who actually, through journalism and getting more information out there, helped in breaking up the trusts. We also had progressive political movements. Teddy Roosevelt was seen as a progressive. They introduced the federal income tax with the 16th Amendment in 1913. In other words, the political system started pushing back on the economic system through all these measures of democracy, through legislation, through journalism, through breaking up monopolies, evening out the playing field for everyone, and introducing taxation. I would note that the reason they had to have an amendment to the Constitution is that the Supreme Court ruled that legislation for an income tax was unconstitutional. Another famous decision. So when we also look at countries that are autocracies or have very populist policies, we can also see, and there have been many studies on this, that this can be a drag on overall growth in a society. So several studies have looked at the policies of autocratic leaders and populists, mainly in Eastern Europe, but also in Latin America, and have found that these policies have reduced the overall growth rate in the country. Because sometimes what is politically expedient in the short term is not necessarily what one needs to do for the long term to invest for further growth. It's also led to misguided or inefficient policies, and of course can lead to corruption. Work in Latin America, which besides the US has some of the highest rates of income inequality, particularly countries such as Brazil, has also shown that higher inequality within the economy leads to lower national economic growth rates. So that's some food for thought. And I think my conclusion is that countries prosper when their citizens prosper and have a voice, both in the economy and in politics. Now, what does this mean in the US? The signs are not great. On the one hand, over the last 12 years, the US economy has been massively successful. Growth has far outstripped Europe's growth, and European per capita GDP is lagging. Now, what does that mean? I mean, if you look 12, 14 years ago, our per capita GDP was much closer to Europe's. Now European per capita GDP, and I'm talking about France, Germany, England, is between $55,000 and $65,000 per capita. Our GDP is over $82,000 per capita. So we have widened the gap with Europe. We have been very successful. And that's been through several administrations. But I think, as we all see, there's some storm clouds on the horizon that can lead to lower growth and lower prosperity in the US. We're seeing an autocratic government that is making policy without referring to any economic sense, it seems. We're certainly seeing a rise of an oligarchy. I think we just need to look at the new cabinet to see that we're getting lots of billionaires, and billionaires seem to have lots of political influence right now. We're seeing increased corruption, both with the president-elect, but also a Congress that's not acting independently. And anytime you introduce something like tariffs and the ability to give or tariffs, put tariffs on or take them away, that is a huge opportunity for corruption in any country. We're seeing more tax cuts for the rich, especially the top 1%, and we're seeing programs and redistribution to people below the 1% being cut way back. The deportation of migrants is definitely going to increase food costs because migrant labor is so important in many aspects of food production, as well as in many other aspects of economic life. We're seeing increasing control of the media, and we're also seeing increasing restrictions on voting through gerrymandering, restrictive voting laws, throwing out ballots as they're trying to do in North Carolina right now. So it's interesting because the last election seemed to be about economics. People were concerned about the price of eggs. They were concerned about they can't buy a house. They were concerned that inflation had an impact on their incomes. But I would note that none of the proposed economic policies that are currently on the table with the new administration will help these issues, and they will probably worsen them. So how will US democracy respond? Because at the end of the day, it's about political institutions and freedom of speech and everything else, but it's also going to hit people in their pocketbooks. They're going to be worse off unless there is more, how should I say it, checks and balances on current decision-making. So just to sum up, elections matter, political institutions matter, and both for democracy and prosperity. Thank you, and I'll take questions. Thank you, Mac.
Globalization. It was represented when it was a matter of theory as fundamentally sort of extending to the world the idea of comparative advantage, corporations and individuals, and it was successful at first. And now it is clearly having enormous impacts, which we're just beginning to recover from in this country, of hollowing out and so forth. But is globalization still a valid economic theory? Or policy, I should say, that should be pursued?
That's a good one. If I could write a book about that, Mac. But it's a very interesting question because if you go back to basic economics, it's the theory of comparative advantage. I'm better at producing shoes and you're better at producing cloth, so I should produce the shoes and you should produce the cloth, and we should trade. And there is some notion of equality in there, meaning there's a level playing field, we both can sell shoes and cloth. And that was the whole idea behind freer trade. And freer trade does benefit everybody. It's benefited consumers in the US hugely. With the price of shoes has fallen, the price of washing machines has fallen, the price of cars so consumers are enjoying the benefits. But on the flip side, a couple of things happen. One is that people always talked about how you had to deal with the people left behind. In other words, as industries moved out of the US, what were you going to do with the workers left behind? The general answer is we're going to retrain and find other jobs and so on. That didn't happen. And it didn't happen in NAFTA either with our trading partners. It wasn't just a problem in the US, it was a problem everywhere. So I think that's one thing. People didn't pay attention within the country to what was happening to the people who were impacted by the policy. I think the second thing is that everybody assumed that trade would be a sort of more or less level playing field globally. Well, you have one country that is not playing by those rules. And if you go back, and when I was working on China, maybe when you were working on China, in the 2000s, it was China should join, be part of the world trading system, and it will become, it will get Western ideas, and its future will be combined with our future because trade knits countries together, and that they will emerge as, part of the global order. Well, that's not what happened in China at all. I mean, first of all, they had a political change with Deng Xiaoping, and that was not China's vision. And China exports something like 98% of its exports are manufacturers. And it is trying to export its way out of an economic crisis that they pretty much created themselves. Countries with more political participation would probably do is start saying, we want more consumer consumption in the country. We want domestic consumption. In other words, we want to have a better life. We want more rice cookers. We want more TVs. We want more better apartments. We want to spend some of this money within the country. And that is not what has been allowed in China for many reasons. One is, the range of consumer items is not as broad. They can't import them anymore. Secondly, people save tremendously because there is no social safety net, there's no pension or anything like that. So you have a very skewed economy. So how can you have a global economy if everybody on the field is not playing by the same rules? And I think we've come to that realization a little late. And I think globalization and the failures to address the loss of manufacturing have led to the anger in the country and unconcern about the economy. But I don't think any of the policies that are being proposed is going to make anybody better off. Bruce.
I was glad you went into the petro companies because they could be considered another counterexample, but I think you closed that door on them. But what would a comparison of Canada and the United States be in terms of what I believe is its much higher democratic score on the rankings?
Not much higher, but
Not
higher.
much, but well, because they don't seem to be going through the same kind of political change that we've gone through, or their oligarchy is even sneakier than ours was.
I don't know if Canada has an oligarchy, but so they're Canadians. No, Canada's interesting because when you say much higher, and I say the US is a flawed democracy, and I'm trying to think of these scores. I think it's like 1 to 10, and the US is like 7, and Canada's like 8 or 9. So it's not like it's, hugely out of it. On the other hand, Canada is floundering on the economic growth side. They are having some economic issues, which may be why they're having some political issues right now. Maybe not the same ones we're having or the same ones Germany is having. But simply being more democratic and having him, being a nice person, like everyone in Canada is, and having a good social safety net doesn't automatically mean you're going to grow either. And that's always been the debate. Are we taxing too much? Are we spending too much on the social safety net? I mean, people have looked to Scandinavia, and Norway is basically a petro state. They get most of their revenues from oil. But if you look at Sweden, Sweden's doing quite well. They're quite democratic and they have some world-class companies now, you know, such as Spotify. Or Denmark, which has two really important companies, Maersk, the shipping company, and of course, Novo Nordisk. So these are countries that have much higher taxation, great safety nets, very democratic political systems, and they've still grown. Because there's always the debate about, you know, do you tax too much? And people have looked at Scandinavia and said, no, their taxes are too high. We can't afford to do that. And I wrote these numbers down. We are not an overtaxed country at all. Okay, so taxation as a percent of GDP, which is a very crude way of doing it. In the European area, it's 19%. In France, it's 24.5%, UK 27.3%. In the US, it is 10%. 10%. We can afford more taxation and more nice things without having an impact on growth. Because, and someone asked me this question in Canada, is there a link between taxation and growth? Because I think this has been the argument of one political party in the US for a long time. And Reagan famously brought down, now, first of all, we've got to remember the US grew a lot after World War II, right? The golden years of the 50s and 60s, and marginal tax rates were up around 70%. Okay, and we grew. And then, of course, 1980, Republicans came in, oh, we can't grow because we're overtaxed, and they lowered tax rates. Reagan increased the tax rates again in his second term, all right? We grew in the 90s. Bill Clinton raised taxes in 1995, and we were booming. Remember, we had a surplus, okay? And we boomed, even though tax rates were high. And we've grown from 2012 to now without the Trump tax cuts. So you can't, there's not necessarily a correlation between high taxes and growth. And maybe they are if you're taxing 50% of your economy, but we are nowhere near there. So we could definitely do more for people. And, you know, but then this is the question of political institutions. We're moving towards political institutions, or at least one political party that believes that taxation is bad and harms growth, even though there have been no study that has shown that that is the case. Oh, since 1980, economists have tried and tried. And can you find the study? Because I can't. But this is the thing, no taxes, no taxes, no taxes. We're a very wealthy country. We're the wealthiest country in the world. Well, bar Switzerland or some small countries in Europe. But I mean, this is pretty amazing. We have, what, 300 million people, and we have this huge, we could afford nice things. But we have a political system right now where many people believe we cannot afford nice things. So that's where the political and the economic come in, and the prosperity and the redistribution of income.
We're talking about taxes. So there's taxation on earned income, there's capital gains, and then there's corporate taxes. And those three, I think the people who are paying taxes on earned income are the ones that feel that taxation is too high. And they don't see what capital gains and corporate tax rates are too low. They just see we're being taxed too much, but they put that earned income tax in the same buckets as capital gains and corporate taxation. They don't, that's what I believe is happening. But the other thought is people, if you're working and you have you're paying taxes on your earned income, and you don't like the way you see tax money being distributed, it feels like even more of a taxation because you don't like the way your tax dollars are being spent.
Those are all good points. And it is true over time that corporate taxes are becoming less and less a percentage of taxes. And income taxes are becoming a higher percentage of total taxes collected. That's true. And for some people, they don't like that because they feel corporations that can pay CEOs millions and millions of dollars, or in the case of Tesla, $56 billion for their CEO, should maybe pay a little bit more. I mean, taxes are the price you pay to live in a free society. And yeah, maybe you don't exactly think they should fund one more warship or one more school feeding program, but that's why you have political representation, right? I mean, in Maine, people do it in their town meetings and argue it out. But if you have true political representation, and we can talk a bit whether we do have true political representation because of gerrymandering and all sorts of restrictions on voting, that's where the compromises are made. And it's always going to be true that, you know, what I choose to spend my money on is not going to be what you choose to spend your money on. But, you know, we all as a society should agree that there are basics that we need to fund: roads and schools and of course the military. And the other thing is what most people don't realize is that the payroll taxes, which go towards Medicare and Social Security, are regressive in the sense that there is a cap on income of $160,000 beyond which you don't have to pay those taxes. Well, why is that? You could probably, I think I read, you could solve like 3/4 or 2/3 of the Social Security problem if you just applied that tax to everybody, because that is a tax. That's not a pension contribution. That is a tax that goes to fund current people. And that's part of the redistribution aspect of taxation. So yeah, why aren't we applying it to Elon Musk's? We apply it to Elon Musk's pay and solve the whole problem. But see, that's part of the problem. I mean, people, the average person sees that their tax burden is high as a percentage of their income, while they feel it's not high as a percentage of income for very rich people. I think Warren Buffett famously said, why is my secretary paying a higher percentage in taxes than I am?
But I'm gonna argue that working people think they are the same as oligarchs, and that this gives value to the flat tax rate of 15% or whatever number you want to pick. We should all just pay 15% instead of saying we need a progressive tax rate and the tax rate should go higher the more money you make. And I don't think that that's a disincentive actually on economic growth. But the trying to understand for me why our democracy is being eroded is because of these, I consider pocketbook issues are not fully understood. And so people are voting against their own interests without knowing it. That's my opinion, and that I'm not trying to be arrogant because I'm not, because I still have so much to learn. But I think that somehow there's a disconnect between voting in your best interest and how people actually vote.
Definitely.
So do we have a democracy if people are voting against their own best interests and against the best interests of democracy?
Well, those are two different questions. If they're voting against their own self-interest, that's up to you if you make that choice, right? You may be quite well-to-do and you think, you know, I want more of a Swedish type system and I want more taxes and more benefits for everybody and I'm willing to pay my share. Or you may say, no, I don't want to pay anything. I think nobody should pay any taxes and we shouldn't have any benefits. Okay, so that's two different things. I think one of the problems with the tax system is that people who are very, very wealthy get a lot of their income not through income, but you know, they get it through interest or they get it through all sorts of other things that are not taxed at the same rate. And the wealthier you are, the more you can afford advice on how to help you legally avoid taxes. So it is not a level playing field. And most of those CEOs that are earning fantastic amounts, only a small amount of that may be salary that's taxed.
Right.
It may be stock benefits, it may be other sorts of income that is not taxed at the same rate. So I think most people look at their paycheck and it's, yeah, we tend to tax income because we can control it and we can see it. And it's hard to tax everything else. But yes, some people say, yeah, we'll get more taxes out of oligarchs if we had a 15% tax rate. I wouldn't bet on it. Really. I mean, there's a very large number of lawyers that'll make sure that doesn't happen, but it is one thought. It is very regressive.
I'll ask another one if you'll let me.
Sure, I can. We still have time.
There's this theory which is swarmed across the land of, it's called modern monetary theory. And I guess the basis of it is that it doesn't matter how much debt the United States has, it prints the money, everybody needs the dollar. And the only guardrail is inflation. And if inflation begins to tick up in a way, then amber red lights go on and we start doing something else. So creating more debt and using that debt to do all the things that we know we have to do is a way to promote growth.
It is.
But yet there's a huge, cohort of people who say, no, no, no. They view the US like they view their household budget and we have to balance it and on and on and on. But I'm interested in what you think.
It's a huge debate. But, think about it from the point of view of your household budget, okay? It used to be before there were household mortgages, back in the 1930s, right? All you paid was interest on your mortgage. You never ended up owning your house, okay? Today, most people go into debt. The big items are a house and a car, right? And most people consider that debt helps. Most people could never possibly afford to save up for a house. They'd probably be 60 and ready to retire by the time they saved up for a house if there wasn't the mortgage industry. Same with cars. All right. Why do people keep buying cars and so on and so forth? Look, they can get them financed. They're easy to finance. They can carry that debt. And of course, no bank lets you carry more debt than you can repay. And that's the problem with countries in debt. There does get to be a point where your debt payments become, like your household budget, too much of your income. Okay. And usually the warning lights are like 100, 125% of GDP, which we're not at, but we used to have debt levels at only 6% of GDP, right? Now, how do we get rid of the debt levels? It's very easy. It's taxation. It's more taxation. It isn't like we're not wasting the money. Where does the money go? It goes to Social Security. It goes to Medicare. It goes to the Defense Department. That's where most of it goes. I mean, very small amounts, maybe to USDA and other programs, et cetera, et cetera. So we could afford to get rid of that debt. And so every time somebody talks about, well, we have to reduce the debt, the easiest way to do it is to raise your income, right? I mean, it's the same like if you said, oh, I want that big fancy house, you go and get a better job and earn more income, and then you can afford the big fancy house. We can do it. But the political dialogue is around, no, we won't grow. We've got to cut taxes, and we've got to cut taxes, corporate income taxes, right? We don't have to. We don't have to at all, but that's the way the political discussion has formed. So yeah, what is exactly the right level of debt? No one knows. But I would argue if you don't have strong guardrails in place in a country, I would be very reluctant. I mean, look at the case of Japan. I mean, everybody knows Japan was growing so much in the 1980s. We were afraid of Japan. It was going to eat our lunch. And then Japan entered the doldrums and only recently has started to grow. And during that time, they spent a lot of money trying to gin up the economy. They had, deflation. Now they have very high levels of debt, and yet they managed to keep going. So when people look at that with the US, I think that the modern monetary theory is debt is not bad, but too much debt is always bad. You know, what is a reasonable amount? Again, you can fix it very easily, just raise taxes on wealthy people. Anyway, any more questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.